More than 70,000 Americans died of drug ODs last year. Nearly half of those overdosed on synthetic opioids like fentanyl. President Trump has signed legislation that should make it harder to ship drugs like fentanyl through the mail. Will that be enough? The number one manufacturer of fentanyl is China. They seem uninterested in stemming the flow of illegal drugs into our country. So the question is, if China killed 30,000 Americans through bombing campaigns or by invading, of course, we might respond differently. Senator Rob Portman is one of the few who's been on this topic for a while. He's just introduced legislation. The president just signed it, and he joins us tonight. Senator, thanks very much for coming.
Tucker, thanks for having me on.
Appreciate it. So it is, I think, a fair question. 3,000 Americans died in 9/11. We're at war for 17 years. 30,000 died just last year because of this, and it seems to be all but unnoticed here in Washington.
I agree. It's the underreported story out there, and it's not that people don't care about it. They do. When I'm home, I hear about it all the time. When we have our teletown hall meetings every month, I ask a question, how many of you have been directly affected? It's always more than half of the callers. This is, 10, 20,000 callers. So it's a huge issue. Sadly, Ohio is one of the states that's been hardest hit.
Yes.
Number one killer, fentanyl. 2/3 of our overdose deaths last year were from fentanyl. It's a synthetic form of opioids, and we know where it's coming from. China, and we know where it's coming in through, and that's the United States Postal Service, a government agency. So what we have done over the past 3 years, we've researched it, we've investigated it, we've put together legislation. It took us too long to get it done because there was some pushback, particularly from the post office. In fact, there still is. But all we're asking them to do is to screen packages so that our law enforcement can at least stop some of this poison coming into our communities and raise the price of this incredibly powerful, deadly drug on the streets of our cities, of our communities, and also reduce the cost.
Well, good for you, and bless you for raising it and making noise about it consistently. What can the U.S. do to change its posture toward China to put some pressure on the Chinese government to clamp down within their country?
Well, it's a good question. I've met with the Chinese ambassador here. I've met with the Chinese leadership there. I've raised it consistently. What they have said is two things. One, that they have made some of the precursors, in other words, the chemicals that go into making fentanyl, illegal. They have, in effect, scheduled them under, the way we would do it here, and that they've begun, they say, secondly, to crack down on some of these chemical companies that are producing it. But what they've done has not been effective. I mean, it continues to come in. Our investigation indicated that if you send something by the Postal Service from China, that it's guaranteed delivery. If you send it through one of the other carriers, say FedEx or UPS or DHL, a private carrier, it's not guaranteed. Why? Because after 9/11, we required all the private carriers to provide advanced electronic data to law enforcement to be able to identify suspect packages and to be able to stop this stuff coming in. We didn't do it for the post office. We said, you ought to study it, come back to us with the report. They never have.
Blue Ribbon Commission. When we've talked about this with guest after guest on the show, the response I get almost every time is, well, it's America's fault because it's our users who are consuming these drugs and dying after becoming addicted to them. Do you think it's America's fault that 30,000 people are dying of synthetic opioid ODs?
It's both. We have, obviously, a demand issue here.
Right.
We have a demand for drug that's insatiable, seemingly, but we also have this incredibly inexpensive poison coming onto our streets, into our communities, mostly from China, mostly through the Postal Service. So by reducing that supply, we can impact this. I believe, Tucker, that over the last few years, we've done a lot, some with congressional legislation, some at the local level, push back on the opioid crisis, and we would be seeing some progress already, but for fentanyl. In other words, it has overwhelmed the system.
Right.
4,000% increase in fentanyl overdose deaths in Ohio in the last 5 years. When I first got started on this a few years ago, fentanyl was not a big deal. Now it is, and I think it has, in effect, kept us from making the progress we otherwise would have made with prevention, education, with more treatment, better recovery programs, more first responders having Narcan to save lives, the miracle drug that reverses the effects of an overdose. So I think we're going to begin to see some progress if we can stem this flow of fentanyl.
And very quick, as a matter of public consciousness, how different do you think this would be if this drug were coming from Russia rather than China?
I think coming from anywhere, it should be something we care a lot about.
Well, I agree with you completely.
Yeah, and I think we should be tougher, and I think we should actually be saying to the Chinese, in this case, you've got to crack down in your own country, both for our purposes, and if you don't, as I have told Premier Li in person, who's the second-ranking leader over in China, it's going to be in your communities too. I mean, this stuff is so deadly, and it is so addictive that it's something that you should care about as well.
Senator, thank you very much.
Thanks, Tucker. Thanks for following this, and thanks for raising the awareness on this issue.
70,000 people die. It's worth paying attention to,
sure
I think.
is.
Thank you.
You bet. Thank you.